Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Our speaker this evening is the Honorable Jacques Gansler, who was the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics from 1997 until 2001. In that position, he was responsible for all matters relating to Department of Defense acquisition, research, development, logistics, acquisition reform, advanced technology, international programs, environmental security, nuclear, chemical, and biological programs, and the defense technology and industrial base, with an annual budget of over $180 billion and a workforce of over 300,000. Prior to that appointment, Dr. Gansler was Executive Vice President and Corporate Director for Task Incorporated, an applied information technology company in Arlington, Virginia. Prior to that, he had served in government as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Material and Acquisition and as Assistant Director of Defense Research and Engineering, responsible for all defense electronics research and development. Prior to his government career, he had held executive positions with IT&T, Singer Corporation, and Raytheon. He currently is a professor and holds the Roger C. Lippitt's Chair in Public Policy and Private Enterprise in the School of Public Policy and is the director of the Center for Public Policy and Private Enterprise at the University of Maryland. He is the author of 5 books, including Democracy's Arsenal, the just published book that he's going to be discussing with us tonight, as well as a contributing author to 25 other books. He holds a bachelor's in engineering from Yale, a master's in science and engineering from Northeastern, and an MA in political economy from the New School, and a PhD from American University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jacques Gansler.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the World Affairs Council for this opportunity, and I'm anxious to hear from you in terms of concerns or questions that you have as a result of what I say. I should point out, when it was pointed out that I had a $180 billion budget, that is about half of what it is today. And it was the last 10 years we've obviously lived in a rich man's world. The total defense budget at that time was $360 billion. Now it's over $700 billion, especially if you count the supplemental. It's well over $700 billion. So you can see that we've lived in a rich man's world for the last 10 years, but I will point out, I think, that most people think it's not going to live that way in the next 10 years. In other words, we're probably going to be facing some crunches. But let me put this in perspective. I think that probably the most obvious thing that's happening in the world today is that we're going through a period of dramatic change, whether I think of it technologically, economically, geopolitically, and particularly in terms of security, which is, of course, what we're going to be talking about tonight. So if you think that's going to happen for the next few decades, then it would make sense that 20th century policies, structures, assumptions are all going to have to change. And that if that's the case, in order to adjust to the 21st century realities, then we're going to have some significant changes in the security arena, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. And I should emphasize that when I talk about the security arena, I'm talking about both the government side and the industry side. In other words, it's, if you will, supply and demand, or however you want to view it, but the reality is that this is an integrated operation, industry, government. And you should understand, and I know you'd be willing to guess at this, that no matter whenever there's significant change, there's incredible resistance to change. And so you should expect resistance to change, you will get resistance to change, and you have to figure out ways to overcome that resistance to change if you want to move to the new world. So I think the wake-up calls that came for this recognition of the change, undoubtedly with 9/11 2001, was certainly one of them. I would argue that the anthrax attack on Capitol Hill was a second one. And probably the biggest one is the collapse of the U.S. economy. And if I put that together, then what we're talking about as probably a number one priority is the debt buildup that came with that collapse of the economy and the expectation that that will continue to get worse because of demographics. You probably are all aware that every day in America, 10,000 people age into Social Security. So Social Security, Medicare, are going to continue to grow and eat up a larger and larger share of the economy. The other, I guess, interesting statistic is probably the fact that it's projected that by 2017, the payment on the debt annually will equal the defense budget. That's pretty big. That's also scary. But that's the direction we're heading by all estimates. Now, I'm sure a lot of you may have read Paul Kennedy's work and others who have pointed out the strong interrelationship between a country's economy, its national wealth, if you will, and its national security. They are strongly tied together, but probably the interesting statement that I would quote to you is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mike Mullen, recently said, and I'll quote here, "America's number one national security threat is its deficit." That's from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So is that important? Yes, I think it clearly is. But you have to recognize there are lots of other important security concerns. Worldwide instability. That one was one that the former director of national intelligence, Admiral Dennis Blair, then he said that, and I quote again, "The number one external threat to U.S. security is the worldwide instability that we're seeing." Now, Denny said that before what happened in North Africa and the Middle East, because he was fired shortly before all that occurred. But the list goes on in terms of concerns. Terrorism, both at home and abroad, violent religious fundamentalism, rogue nuclear states. I think another one I'd put in that list is the international narco-criminals. If you've ever seen any estimates of their budget, it actually is expected to be around $400 billion a year. That's pretty significant in terms of by the way, some of their sophisticated stuff, like submarines for bringing drugs from South America to America, are really quite sophisticated and also inexpensive, which I'll get to later. Regional conflicts, failed states, struggles for scarce resources like water, energy, food, so forth. Pandemics, SARS was an example. And the usual normal thing you think about are potential future peer competitors. And obviously the one that's most frequently mentioned there is China. And I will come back and talk about China in a few minutes. So I could go through a list based on those threats, anticipated and real today, and tick off a list of what I think are 10 critical things we therefore have to have in order to be able to address those concerns. I'll just tick them off. Missile defense. Well, for example, there are over 100 nations that have missiles today, so missile defense is important, tactical and strategic. Biodefense. Everybody can easily get, at low cost, biological weapons of mass destruction. Counters to all forms of terrorism. I guess I'd put pirates in that category, but also all the way up to loose nuclear weapons in that category. Cyber defense. That's the one that you read most about right now, and you're going to have a talk on apparently next time. But this covers cyber attacks on our power grid, for example, or air traffic control systems, but also the military command and control systems. And so across the board, we are increasingly dependent on cyber and increasingly being attacked on cyber. You probably have seen the statement made by the head of Cyber Command recently, who said that today, Department of Defense computers alone receive over 6 million intrusions a day. Now, a lot of this is just hackers, kids fooling around. A lot of them are other things. But that's a large number, 6 million a day. We have to have capability to counter the widespread proliferation that's taking place around the world today, in many cases of weapons of mass destruction, but also of their delivery vehicles. We have to have the enhanced intelligence capability, because now the world is very different. In fact, what we're seeing from the need for intelligence is pretty clear, and it became very obvious, I think, in the bin Laden event recently. Everybody gives credit, and they should get credit, to the special forces, but it was really the intelligence that allowed that to happen. And so we're going to have to continue to emphasize enhanced intelligence. We have to have and continue to enhance nuclear deterrence. We have to have, and most of the focus now of the budget is on conventional conflict overmatch against this asymmetric conflicts that we're likely to be seeing. Rupert Smith from the UK called this war among the people. That's what we're really seeing now in Iraq and Afghanistan. People hiding behind children and women, people obviously putting roadside bombs. It's a very different environment, and the challenge there for intelligence and for operations is considerably different. But we have to go all the way up to traditional peer engagements as well. Another one I'd list is that's most prevalent right now in Iraq and growing in Afghanistan as a problem is post-conflict stability, security, recovery, reconstruction. Statements have come out of the Pentagon saying that this is as high a priority as warfighting. But if you look at what's happening today in Iraq and Afghanistan, we are not adequately prepared for that kind of reconstruction and stability and security. And then last and not least by any means is Homeland Security. So those 10 cover quite a spectrum in terms of a broad 21st century environment. And what I found really interesting compared to that long list was the recent statements that came out from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in describing the security environment for the next decade. The one single word that described it was uncertainty. Now, which of those 10 do you prepare for? Which 3 do you prepare for? Do you prepare for all 10 of them? Wow, that's very expensive, and that's probably not affordable. And so then how do you handle this broad spectrum and do it affordably? And again, as I mentioned earlier, I personally don't think that we can expect the defense budget again to double in the next 10 years. In fact, I suspect most of you don't. And my guess would be that in anything, Secretary Gates is probably being optimistic by saying we have to do more for the same. I think most people now believe we're going to have to do more for less. And that's the challenge that I want to talk about mostly today. I think it's very clear that it's not going to grow. And if that's the case, then even the challenge of doing more for the same is still very real. But if you're going to have an ability to cover that broad spectrum, then you have to have an ability to be responsive and flexible and move fast. And again, this system is not known for rapid response, and it certainly isn't known for low cost. So how are we going to be able to handle that? When I say not rapid response, I tease the Air Force a little bit about the fact that their new airplane, the F-22, they named it that because it took 22 years to develop it. You got to think about that. How much has technology changed in 22 years? For information technology, every 18 months, not 18 years. So you can see that that's a real challenge in terms of responsiveness and in terms of expense. And I guess I should tell the same story for the F-35, their new fighter plane. It's called that because it was designed to be $35 million each. Today it's about $130 to $150 million each, but it's still called the F-35. That was the design objective for it when it was being used by 11 nations and the largest program in history. So when it multiplies up that way, you can see we have a fiscal challenge. So expensive? Yeah, I mean, how many aircraft carriers do you want to buy? They're about 11 to 13 billion each, but that doesn't include the airplanes. They're extra. If you want to buy those too, you want airplanes on it, you got to pay for those separately. So it's very, very expensive stuff, but I should emphasize it's not just the weapons that are so expensive. It's also the support for that. Let me give you a simple example. Obviously, you're very familiar in the U.S. economy, the medical costs are rising rapidly. For the Department of Defense, they're rising at twice the rate of the overall economy in terms of medical costs. In 2009, the DoD medical costs for families and troops and retirees was $83 billion. That's a big number. And if you look at some of the other major costs, like logistics cost, last year we spent $270 billion on logistically supporting the troops. The problem is we don't do a world-class job compared to Walmart or FedEx or UPS in terms of responsiveness, in terms of reliability to get the right piece to the right part, the right place, in terms of cost. So we have a big opportunity there to do a lot better job by using modern information technology. You know, if you ask UPS or FedEx what business they're in, they'll say they're in the information technology business. When we talk to the Department of Defense, they talk about they're moving metal and parts and bullets. It's a different perspective that we have to modernize in order to catch up with modern information technology here. And that's a way in which we can start to get the ability to do more with less if we can become more efficient and effective. Unfortunately, what I'm most worried about right now, what I see happening, is the initial reactions by the Department of Defense to this challenge of how to get more with less. A lot of it tends to be what I would categorize as short-term thinking, or it could be nice about it, call it that. I could also call it false economic thinking. Let me give you some examples. You probably all read in the paper that we can't afford to have a competitive engine for the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter. It's the largest program in history, and we actually had an example of where we competed two engines for the F-16 and F-15, large number of engines. And in that case, both engines got higher reliability, higher performance, and lower cost because of the presence of competition. It seems funny to have to go to the Pentagon and give them a lecture about capitalism. But, you know, in reality, they picked one rather than two. In that case, the Air Force felt that they had saved over $4 billion net on the joint on this competition for the Great Engine War, they called it. And so why aren't we doing it again on a program that's a lot larger and where everything is much more expensive? It would seem to me you'd think about trying to get the same kind of savings. Another area where there's some false economics, you've been reading in the paper that the president and the secretary have said we've got to insource a lot more work, bring it into the government instead of competing in industry. So the first thing the Air Force did on that, they said, well, we'll save 40% by doing maintenance work in-house. What that is based on is the hourly cost of one worker in the government versus the fully loaded cost of whatever number of workers it takes to do it from the commercial side in a competitive environment. Now, the Congressional Budget Office did analysis of that specific question of in-housing maintenance or doing it competitively in the commercial world. They said you'd save 90% by doing it contractually. Why don't we read that report and do it? You know, this is kind of the ambiguity of what I think might be called false economic thinking. Another area that I'm very concerned about is if I look at the history of what happens when the budgets start getting cut, which I think they will, it's very clear what's the first thing cut, which is research. In other words, what we're doing is paying for the present and giving up the future. But our strategy since World War II, actually, has been, for the national security strategy of the DoD, has been technological superiority. Will we be able to maintain technological superiority if we don't do research? And will we be able to maintain a workforce of research-type activities if we don't do funded research? And I think what I find interesting is if you look at the strategies of China, India, other countries, they are emphasizing the importance of science and technology and the importance of it from an innovative perspective, from an economic perspective, and a security perspective, and a workforce perspective. We need to do the same thing, in my opinion, because if not, we're not going to maintain our technological leadership in either economic or security areas. And I could go on with a long list of these, what I consider to be false economic actions that are being taken. But let me move to what I think should be done in order to try to address this question of how to get more for less. First, I would argue at the national level, we need to create incentives for multi-agency activities. Now, I want to emphasize that multi-agency, when I was undersecretary, my deputy was over, after I left, he was sent over to Iraq to set up a banking system, and he sent me back an email. He was shocked that the State Department and the Defense Department were competing against each other to hire workers. I mean, that's not a coordinated effort. And we really need to have multi-agency activities similar to what the Goldwater-Nichols bill did for the Defense Department, saying that we want to have joint multi-service activities. In other words, it's really wrong for us to think we're going to fight a war separately of the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy. They're going to fight together. In the same way, when you go over to Iraq or Afghanistan today, you have AID, state, and defense as a minimum. You even want Treasury and others to be involved. We need to have a combination of what has been referred to as soft power and hard power. The soft power being State Department negotiations and treaties and controls, arms controls, things of that sort. Then a direct complement to that multi-agency activity is in the area of recognizing that I believe, and I think everyone I've ever talked to, believes that there is no scenario that we can imagine in the national security arena for the future that can be handled by any one nation. It has to be multinational. You can't address terrorism by a single nation. You can't address cybersecurity with a single nation. I mean, if I want to attack him, I'll go through China to attack him by cyber. I won't attack him directly. So we need agreements from other countries as to controls on each of these areas. So these multinational solutions are going to require other countries to take part. Since I mentioned China, let me pick on them. They are clearly the number 2 economic power in the world and growing, and they are also greatly growing in their military power. Now, we need them to help us with a lot of their neighbors, actually, in terms of agreements to help us with Afghanistan, to help us, frankly, with even Iran. We certainly need them to settle down in the straits between Taiwan and so forth. But most important, I think, we don't want to start to build them up as an adversary. We want to try to work with them as a partner, because that's about the only way I can envision peace and stability in the world in the future, is with the two of us as the 2 leading economic and military powers in the world working together. They certainly can help us a lot with North Korea and the nuclear capability there, Pakistan nuclear capability. I was very encouraged when I read recently, I guess it's a quirk of mine, but I read the Washington Post in the morning and I read China Daily in the evening every day, and because it's pretty obvious what's happening in the world today, that China matters. And I happen to see in recent issues that, again, Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chief, just worked out a deal with his counterpart in China that we would run joint U.S.-China anti-pirate exercises in the Gulf of Eden coming up. And he also reached agreement that next year we would run joint humanitarian relief exercises. This military-to-military operations is really critical if we're going to try to partner with them at all. So let me then sort of give you a brief overview of the steps we have to take within the Department of Defense, because I talked about multi-state and multi-agency, but within the Defense Department itself to get more for less. And the key to that is what's called acquisition reform. But it requires really actions in 4 areas, I think. What we buy, how we buy, who does the buying, and who we buy from. Look at that as a package. That's basically a very highly integrated, really very interrelated set of things that go from the requirements process to the procurement process to the acquisition workforce of the government and then the industrial base. And that complements the multi-agency, multinational approaches that are absolutely essential if we're going to get all the benefits. So let me cover those four briefly, and then we'll go into the Q&A. First and most critical in the acquisition area is what we buy. I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? There's no point in perfectly buying the wrong things. So we may as well worry first about what it is we're going to buy, and then worry about how we go about doing it. And the most critical step in the new way we should approach requirements is making cost a military requirement. Now, traditionally, it has not been the case. What we aim for is the best for our boys, if you will, the maximized performance. That costs a lot of money, and it may not be the right thing to do. We've had examples, though, where we've done it properly. Some of you may be familiar with the JDAM missile. It was a joint missile. And the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, I have a copy of his handwritten note, which he wrote the requirements for that missile. And there were only 3 requirements for it. It should hit the target. This was an air-to-ground missile. Second, that's not 12 decimal places. I mean, that's, hit the target what I wanted. Second one was to work. That's a strong reliability requirement, right? And the third one was it should cost under $40,000 each so we can afford enough of them. Today, it hits the target, it works, and costs $17,000 each. That's the way we should worry. That's the way you and I buy. If we wrote a military requirement for our car, we'd all drive Lamborghinis. But we also probably put some resource constraints on our requirement, and that determines what we're going to buy. The military needs to do a similar thing. Now, the second of the requirements area that is way off base today is we have a set of regulations, policies, laws, which are 100% written around buying goods, airplanes, ships, tanks, things like that. Last year, I chaired a Defense Science Board study that we looked at buying services. Congress mandated this. It turned out last year that, like the U.S. economy, by the way, which is shifting to a service economy, 57% of all the dollars spent in the Department of Defense last year were for services, not for goods. And yet all our requirements and our regulations and our policies and our practices and our education are all geared around buying goods. And yet it's really different to buy services. I mean, think about, the typical weapon. We go through the research and development phase and then the test and evaluation phase. We have these major milestones for weapons. How do you do that with a systems engineer? You worry about how we're going to do that. I think we clearly need to have separate policies, practices, laws, and so forth for buying services, and I'll come back to that in a minute. An additional requirement that one we just talked about a few minutes ago is what things we do in-house versus those things we contract out competitively, so-called insourcing, or you want to do work in the government which is inherently governmental work. And there are lots of things that are inherently governmental, like managing, like decision-making, like budgeting, all of the oversight, so forth. But the definition that exists today that the Office of Management and Budget put out had 3 types of things that you're going to do that are inherently governmental. I only agree with one of them. The first one says inherently governmental is all work that is inherently governmental. Literally, that's what they wrote. No, you can't argue that point. But the second one says inherently governmental is anything that supports inherently governmental. Why would you do anything that doesn't support inherently governmental? So everything gets covered. And then the third one, which is even a better one, anything that's critical is inherently governmental. What isn't critical? I mean, even serving food to the troops, if you poison them, that's critical. So everything is critical. So that's not a very acceptable definition of inherently governmental. I think we need to be much more specific and try to come up with some definitions that are really defining inherently governmental much more carefully, because when contractors do it in a competitive environment versus the monopoly of the government doing its own work, you get a very different result, and all the data show that overwhelmingly. Even when we compete public against private, and the public sector often wins because they really do know their work, but then they bid on the basis of the most effective organization rather than their current organization. And the data are overwhelming no matter who wins, the average savings is over 30%, and you get better performance because then you're measuring it. The last two that before Congress ruled it against the law to compete public-private competitions, the last two the public sector won with a savings of 70% in one and 82% in the other. It's amazing why we have laws against doing something that's that good. So I guess in the last thing I want to cover in the requirements area is making sure that we're addressing the likely 21st century scenarios, military requirements, if you will, and 21st century technologies to address those problems. For example, right now, most of our planning is being done on the basis of each individual weapon standing alone, maximizing the performance of that individual thing, whether it's a ship or plane, a tank or something. But the way we're actually capable of doing and the way we're moving towards is something called net-centric warfare, where you have distributed sensors, distributed shooters, you take advantage of the fact you see it from multiple directions, you get intelligence from satellites, from unmanned vehicles, from robots on the ground, all that integrated. And every single soldier and Marine now is a sensor and a shooter because he's equipped with something called Land Warrior, where he's got a GPS on his shoulder, he's got a mouse on his chest, he can communicate with everybody. He's got a little eyepiece that displays for him all his friends and all his enemies, getting intelligence data being distributed. He has on his gun an infrared system and a camera so he can shoot around corners. You have to stick his head out. So every soldier and Marine now is a node on that net-centric operation. And that's a very different thing than saying every single platform has to be self-sufficient, because those self-sufficient platforms are very, very expensive. So you have far fewer of them. And now you get into the question of quantity. And some of you may be familiar with Lancaster's law that says force effectiveness is proportional to individual weapons effectiveness times numbers squared. So if you're resource constrained, you have a choice of buying a few very expensive systems or a large number of inexpensive systems, and the numbers get multiplied squared in terms of more effectiveness. So there's a trade-off clearly that we can make there. And by the way, in his eyepiece, he also has the position of all of his friends, which cuts down dramatically on the self-inflicted wounds that we've had. For about 15% of the kills are self-inflicted in most conflicts historically. We also need to combine kinetic war with cyber war, the way that Russia did when they went into Georgia. Assume you're going to do that, so emphasize the kinetic and cyber combination, electronic warfare, if you will. That's clear. And lastly, as I said, we need to worry about war, this asymmetric war among the people, which I would emphasize is not a simple subset of a tank-on-tank battle. They're really dramatically different, and we need to plan for those differences. And, of course, to do that, you need to worry about the research that I talked about as well. And, not spending the money on the research, to use a Midwestern term, is simply eating your seed corn. You're just throwing away your future if you don't do that. Okay, so that's what we buy. The second question is how we buy. And here you got to recognize that, for example, a large amount of what we're now buying is for expeditionary operations. And that means you're in the war zone and you're going to be shot at, and you have to worry about rapid response. And speed is critical. And that's different than the present process that has detailed milestones going through in long period of time. For example, if the combatant commander says, I want to put up a tent city right away. Yes, sir. Well, we've been taught in school that first you'd spend 6 months writing the description of exactly what you want, and then 6 months putting out a request for proposal, and then 6 months giving industry time to respond, and then 6 months for source selection. You go through the regular process. That's not exactly what he had in mind. And we have to learn that in that environment, we need rapid response. So you need different systems for rapid response. In the same way, you need different systems for buying information systems. Information systems don't follow the model that buying an airplane does, especially since they evolve every 18 months. That's different. Services, as I mentioned earlier, is very different. And the way the commercial world works is also very different, and I'll come back and talk about that a little bit as well, because we can get from the commercial world rapid response if it's off the shelf. But you can't do all of that with a single set of laws, regulations, and policies and practices. And then the third area, who does the buying? This is the acquisition workforce. Unfortunately, in the post-Cold War period, we grossly undervalued the importance of the acquisition workforce in the Department of Defense. Let me give you some examples. In 1990, I just did a commission for Bob Gates on this one, so I had some data on it at least. In 1990, the Army had 5 general officers with a contracting background. When we did the commission in 2008, that was the last set of data we had, they had 0. Not a single general officer with contracting background. The Air Force had cut their contracting general officers in half and their SESs in half. The Defense Contract Management Agency, which manages contracts, you would think that's an important one. In 1990, they had 4 general officers. In 2008, they had 0. They went from 25,000 people to 10,000 people. So clearly, this is an example of neglect of the acquisition workforce, I think. What we really need are smart buyers, people with skills and experience, if we're going to do this buying. And they need flexibility, and they need authority to operate in this rapidly changing, very diverse environment. And the other thing that most of them don't have is an understanding of how industry works. They understand how the government works, but they don't understand how to create incentives for industry, because that's what the market would do in a normal environment. But with a monopsony buyer, you have to create the incentives. You're the only buyer in this environment. And what you want are incentives to get higher and higher performance at lower and lower costs. And you can do that. That's what the commercial world in the computers does every day now. You get higher and higher performance at lower and lower costs. Well, we have a lot of computers, a lot of electronics. We should be able to do a similar thing. And they do it in product life cycles that are measured in the 18-month cycle, not the 18-year cycle. So we, again, have to shift quite significantly, I think. Well, now let me come to the last of the items, because that's what you probably expected I was going to talk all about, because that's about what the book is about, which is the industrial base. And that's who we buy from. And I would argue that's just as important as what we buy, because supply and demand obviously balance these. President Eisenhower, in the famous speech that you're all familiar with about the warning of the military-industrial complex, if you go on in that same speech, in the next paragraph, he talks about we wouldn't have won the war without them. So in terms of importance, I would argue that is important. By the way, Joseph Stalin made the same statement, that the U.S. would not have won World War II without the defense industry. So it's clearly recognized that it is an important element. And that's where I would argue we have to make equally dramatic changes in order to adjust to all the things we just talked about. Okay. Now, any smart industry will do what their customer asks. So that means that what we have to do is have the government change in order for the industry to change. You can't just say to the industry, change. We're going to keep doing things the way we've always done it. When I talk to industry frequently about change, what I get back is my customer doesn't ask for it. If that's the case, if they still want the old stuff from the 20th century, well, that's what we'll give them. So the government has to change, but they have to have some idea, the government has to have some idea of where they want the industry to go. I mean, in other words, they have to have clear vision of what they're looking for, what is the desired industrial base. And I can tell you what it has to be. It has to be responsive, has to be flexible, has to be innovative, has to be competitive, has to be healthy profit-wise. It has to provide state-of-the-art stuff with high quality and low cost. That's what we want from our defense industry. And that low cost has to be also in small quantities. With flexible manufacturing, you can do that, but that's what you have to make sure you're doing. Okay. Do we have that now? That effective, efficient, and so forth industrial base? There was a Defense Science Board study that came out in 2008, and I'll quote from that, says, quote, "We currently have a consolidated 20th century defense industrial base, not the required transformed 21st century industrial base. It was what we did in the post-Cold War period. We consolidated from 50 firms to 5. We consolidated vertically so that where we used to have competition on who supplies the radar or who supplies the engine and computer or whatever, if we vertically integrate, you buy it from your own division and you explain why it's a better one than anybody else has. But that eliminates the competitive options even at some of the lower tiers. So we eliminated, went from 50 to 5 and vertically integrated, and that's what led them to say we don't have what we're looking for. Let me give you 2 examples of what I think we should be looking for. One is buying commercial goods and services. Now, every speech that every congressman gives and every Department of Defense official gives says we're going to buy commercial stuff. The problem is that they pass laws and policies and requirements against it. And so you can't do it if it's against the law. For example, there are specialized cost accounting systems that have to be set up. There's intellectual property claims that the government makes. There are export controls that the government places on commercial stuff. There are lots of these government-unique rules and regulations that are basically forcing separation of military and commercial. Now, I'll give you an example of that. Boeing used to build commercial and military transports, in the same plant in Wichita. Because of specialized cost accounting standards, they were forced by the DoD to separate the two. So they had to set up a separate plant for the DoD transports and the commercial transports. And that means the DoD had to absorb the high overhead from the second plant. And that's not necessarily in our national security interest, but that met the requirements. I think this bars state-of-the-art, low-cost, off-the-shelf commercial goods, and the same thing applies for services. If you have to set up a separate accounting system and allocate your overhead differently, and also even in terms of export controls. So let me raise the second point, which is, in addition to buying commercial, we have to take advantage of the globalized market. Technology today is globalized, industry is globalized, and we have laws against taking advantage of the globalized market. Significant barriers, I would call them, taking advantage. Yet, every single U.S. weapon system today has foreign parts in it. Now, that's because they're better, not because they're cheaper. We want to get state-of-the-art stuff. But to take advantage of it, we can use foreign designs. I'll give you a couple of examples there. The littoral combat ships that are now being procured, they are both foreign designs, the 2 competitive designs. The MRAP, the armored vehicle that the Army now has, that has V-shaped underside for the roadside bombs that was designed in South Africa. It has armor that was designed in Israel. It has ruggedized axles that were developed in Europe and electronic devices from Asia. It's an international program in order to get the best of those things. But if we want to send a part back to the source of any of these controlled items, we have to fill out forms and get permission to send it back to the country that sent it to us. We have some pretty silly rules. I'll give you another example. Recently, Boeing had to pay $15 million on the export of the 767 commercial airplanes. You'd say, why? Is that a high risk? Well, they had a little chip in the avionics, which was also in the Maverick missile. Commercial chip, but in the missile as well. And therefore, they violated the export control laws and had to pay $15 million for it. Another example, in Kosovo, when the U.S. planes and the Dutch planes were flying along next to each other, they couldn't talk in a secure mode because we weren't allowed to export the secure information for the export control. So our pilots were vulnerable. Again, you got to raise some questions to some of what I would categorize as obsolete. I could go on with a long horror story list about export controls and import controls as well. Today, the world is globalized, and I would argue that most people who make the rules, i.e. Congress, don't recognize it. I was recently quoted as saying, in this area, Congress is a leading trailing indicator. I mean, they clearly have not caught up with the reality of the 21st century in terms of globalization and taking advantage of globalization rather than trying to treat it as a negative. And I think that's hurting our security and our competitiveness. I'll give you another example of that where it hurt us, I think, a good deal. We used to so-called own the night. We had all the infrared state-of-the-art equipment and everything, and our soldiers and Marines on the ground could see in the nighttime when the adversary couldn't. But we weren't allowed to export that to our allies. So as a result, the French took over the world market for infrared because they didn't have those constraints. So now we are not ahead in infrared anymore. And if you talk to the Army Night Vision Laboratory, they'll tell you that the French are now ahead because they've got a world market that they're taking advantage of in that case. And you can't blame them for that. That's our restriction that caused that to happen. I think, again, our export-import laws have to change. So let me close by just simply a couple of sentences. I think we are in a very, very challenging period today. In fact, one of the most challenging in our nation's history. Economically, we're in shambles. Geopolitically, the world is changing rapidly. And in national security, which is the part we've been talking about. In many ways, this challenge requires a change in our way of thinking, which I would categorize basically as a culture change. Now, there's a lot of literature on how to make culture change. And the conclusion is two things are required for culture change. First and most obvious one is there has to be recognition of the need for change. Otherwise, you're going to get even more resistance to the change. So you've got to convince people that the change is required. Widespread recognition of that need. And then secondly, leadership with a vision, a strategy, a set of actions. These actions usually include things like redistributing resources, reorganizations, new sets of incentives, all that kind of thing. And you have to develop motivation for change across the whole institution. And that has to be sustained over a considerable period of time. You can't get a culture change by putting out a memo saying change your culture. You know, it really takes sustained effort over a long period of time, pushing hard at it. Now, I think Secretary Gates has started that effort in the defense world. I hope that Secretary Panetta will continue that, and I also hope that you'll agree with this and try and help yourself. Thank you very much. Questions? Tomatoes? Whatever you want to throw?
The first thing you said about if the DoD budget gets reduced, one of the first things to go would be research and development, in your opinion. How would you think it'd be possible for them to reduce the budget significantly enough to have a serious change on the economy while not cutting research? Like, what other areas do you think the DoD could cut instead that would be more beneficial to the future of our security? Or do you think it should be put in the hands of the private sector? And then the second question is that how would you respond to, you mentioned the globalization of equipment. Mm-hmm. One idea in international relations is that you don't want to have certain industries in the hands of foreign countries because you don't always know if those countries will be allied with you. So what would you say to that there is a benefit in keeping U.S. domestic production while bringing in the globalized part, having that be stronger?
Okay, let me take both those questions. First of all, the fact that research will be cut is based upon empirical data. And in fact, when I was in the government at one point when the budget was plummeting, each year, each of the services took $100 million out of their research budget, and I had to put it back in. You know, I just directed them to put it in because they were just simply making it obvious they were going to be taking it out. On the other hand, that's still a small percentage of the total dollars. The biggest pot of the dollars is the one I mentioned on logistics, the support functions. Clearly, going to a more efficient and effective logistics system would, out of the $270 billion being spent in that area, you probably could make, even if you made 10% savings, that's $27 billion. You can get some really significant things by improved information systems and by not following the philosophy of a just-in-case model. You might use a just-in-time model, and that's what, of course, the commercial world does. And they have ability, for example, to track all their assets at any time. Kmart knows where everything is all the time. We don't. We don't track. We don't have asset visibility. in the DoD. So that's one area that I think you can make big savings. Other areas we can make big savings is shifting towards those things that are more effective and lower cost. I mentioned having cost as a requirement, for the next generation stuff, but buying off-the-shelf commercial stuff. That's, in many cases, the commercial world is spending more on research than the Defense Department is. And we want to take full advantage of that and buy some of their existing stuff. But you have the problem that leads you to your second question, which is a lot of that commercial stuff is also available worldwide. And therefore, adversaries can also use it. And so then we start putting controls on it. And the question is, where do you put the controls and on whom? And, for example, it took the Congress, I think more than that. I guess it was actually almost 5 years to agree to broaden the boundary of our export controls to include the United Kingdom and Australia. Now, I don't think we're going to go to war with the UK in the near future. And do we trust them? At least we speak almost the same language. And we can really, I think, get them to agree on controls that are similar to ours. That example I gave you about the Dutch planes flying next to each other, I don't think we'll go to war with the Dutch either. We'll have to get them to control their third-party transfers, though, because your point is not a trivial one, being dependent. If you think back when Israel was dependent on the French for their supply, and the French stopped supplying, Israel was in real trouble. They had to build up their own industry in order to fill that gap. But they still take an awful lot of stuff from other places because you can't really afford a totally self-contained operation. But you do have to have reliable supply chains. And one of the ways to do that is you have alternatives. If I'm buying a part from a source that I have in question, I might want to have a U.S. alternative part that's comparable. I might even want to make sure that they're competing. And I use some of them in each case.
From the broader perspective, the strategic side, I worry now, and I'm a Iraq War veteran, and I worry now that we're focused so much on the war in Iraq and Afghanistan that our technology has been skewed to up-armored Humvees and things like this where we spend an enormous amount of money. And I've ridden around on those vehicles, and I'm very glad that we had that technology, and it saved
Especially
a lot of
when the bomb
lives.
goes off under you.
It saved a lot of lives. But it's something that as soon as we're out of there, we're not going to have this situation again. We're probably going to leave those vehicles there for the most part. We have some nifty technology, but it's not something we can use in a larger sense if we run into a problem with Russia or China or a big power. I'm wondering what you see from the strategic side, because I know you've been at that level, that high level, of how we can turn our focus back to what we do best, the airplanes, the ships, whatever we need to fight the larger battle.
Well, a couple of things. I personally think, and so does Secretary Gates, that while we shouldn't be focused exclusively on Iraq and Afghanistan, that they may be typical of a lot of things we may end up in, whether it's Somalia or Nigeria, you pick the place, where the so-called war among the people kind of scenarios, that we can't dismiss that. And clearly it's not a subset of tank-on-tank environments or plane-on-plane environments or ship-on-ship environments. It's a different case. So we need to have the ability to address each of those cases, not just the Russians coming through the Fulda Gap scenario that we had for the Cold War period. On the other hand, it does strike me as very important that we work closely with Russia, China, some of those, to try to figure out if we can avoid war with them. That's the first thing. And certainly in terms of nuclear deterrence, we have to keep our nuclear deterrent posture up, and we want to work with them on that. We also want to work with them on keeping other people from having nuclear, biological, and so forth. I mean, think about it. China has a terrorist threat in the Northwest. China has an environmental problem. China has a water problem. China has a population problem. I mean, a lot of these problems we can work together with them on if we can try to do it. That doesn't mean you have to be naive enough to think that you can ignore them in terms of military environments. And as Secretary Gates' speech that I'm sure you've read recently said, let's see, we have 11 aircraft carriers. China's got one old one. How many more do we need at 11 billion, 13 billion each? We are handling that aspect of it. Now, they have developed an anti-ship missile capability, so we need an anti-ship missile capability. And so we'll have to continue to develop those things. So we have to balance this. The same question about war in space. Can we control that in terms of scenarios and even agreements, which we should be stressing? I mean, that Chinese intercept of a satellite caused all kinds of space debris. We don't need that. It makes their astronauts vulnerable, too, to a piece of junk hitting them. So we could probably work with them on some of these things. That may sound naive, but on the other hand, that's also what the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs is trying to do. And I recently read that Panetta is trying to see if we can open up, more dialogue with China. And the fact that we have the mill-to-mill dialogues going now, which we didn't have a while ago, I think is a positive step in that direction. But I totally agree that we're not going to give up on airplanes and ships and tanks. It's just that when Bill Perry did an analysis a few years ago of our current budget and said that over 80% of it was devoted to 20th century stuff, we can't afford that kind of an unbalance. We have to assume that we are going to have scenarios similar to what we now have in Iraq and Afghanistan. We may be in Pakistan for all I know. And so you have to think about each of those common things and find out what stuff you can use and can't use. The unmanned systems, for example, we're now starting to use all over. We certainly would use those also in a tank-on-tank scenario. I mean, I spent a day riding around the back of a tank out in the California desert, and I could see the big advantage of having a bunch of stuff flying overhead telling me where the enemy was rather than my trying to find them, And so I think your point is well taken, but on the other hand, not to the overbalance of one type because we like it. We know how to do it. We've always done it. It's our 20th century model. And if we continue to push that, we are going to neglect what other people are doing, including like information warfare. One of the things that is surprising to a lot of people is that Al-Qaeda is better at information systems than we are in terms of recruits and selling, and winning the hearts and minds. We have Madison Avenue. We should be really good at that. But they're actually doing a better job of that than we tend to do. So there's a lot of modern technology that everybody has nowadays in terms of telephones. I mean, they can communicate with each other. We take advantage of that. From our troops have to be able to do the same kinds of things. Okay, I was told that my parking lot closes at 11:30, so I guess we have to end here.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.